developing Windows Forms projects, we've worked with our interface and then the code behind that allows us to interact with that interface and to do things and to process information. For our purposes now in object-oriented programming, we're going to refer to the interface as our view and the code behind as our controller. Now we've already done some things in terms of having a data source that could be external to our project, could be on the internet, could just be on a local hard drive, and we can read and write data to and from that data source using system.io. Well, as we introduce object-oriented programming, we are creating a class. In this case, it will provide instances of our data, and we call that class our model. So you'll hear the term MVC or Model View Controller, and you can think of that architecture of MVC as being just this. Within Windows Forms, our interface, the C# code that is our logic, and then the model which represents the object that we are working with. And there might be multiple models in a program. In this case, our patient class is our data class. We're using it to control data or create instances of that data. And our controller will interact with that model and, in essence, read the data and write the data through that model. So while we're going to open and close the files through our controller is going to pull that data in and extract it through the data model to create objects that we can then use to populate our collection, our data collection. That data collection could be an array. It could be, in this case, the collection of a list view. It could be a list, a generic list. We'll talk more about that down the road. An array list. It could be a dictionary or a hash table. So there's various data structures that we can use to contain the collection of our data objects. Classes have often been compared to being blueprints. And just as in a construction environment, we might have multiple homes that are developed from a blueprint. They each might vary a little bit in terms of the color of the walls, the types of flooring, and so forth. But it's this idea that each home is crafted in the same way with barely the same properties and the abilities to do the same things. So if you take that analogy of the class is our blueprint and our data object is the home, we need some way of creating that data object. And so what we have is a constructor. You might think of the constructor as a contractor in this case with our house idea. And the constructor is named the same as our data class, and we pass it some parameters. It then creates the instance of that data object, and in most cases we're placing that in some type of collection where there are multiple objects. We have an upcoming project in which we're going to read in data for patients in a hospital, and each record of that data file is going to be the room number that the patient's in, their first name, last name, and their date of birth. And we're going to read that data in, and we're going to populate this list view with that information, but the information will be the string value of each data object or each data record. So to create that, we have a class called patient in which we're storing the room, the first name, the last name, and their date of birth. Those are the properties in the fields. And then here is our constructor. This is how we're going to create those objects from the data source, or maybe adding in a new record. So our constructor is named the same as our class. Our class is named patient. The constructor is named the same. It has to be public. And then we're going to pass into it an integer for room, a string for first name, string for last name, and a date time object that I named DOB. And all I'm doing here is populating the properties in the fields of that record with that past information. Now this last one here, the item is a date time object. And in our form, that's going to come from this date of birth date picker. But we're going to store the information in our data file as a string. So when I read in that information from the data source, it's not necessarily a date time object, it's a string. And while I can convert that string to a date time object, oftentimes we'll create what's called an overloaded constructor. It's an overloaded method. An overloaded method is one that's named exactly the same as another method, but its signature is different. The items being passed to it are of a different number, a different order or different types. And the order has to be, if it's a different order, they have to be different types from this signature. So here we have an int string date time object. Here we have an int string. Same order, the date of birth here is a string rather than a date time object. Now when I call patient, C# is going to be smart enough to look at what are the data types being passed and know which constructor to use. So rather than parsing my string into a datetime object in the program, I can do it here in the class simply by passing a string, and then rather than saying dob equals dob, we can say dob equals datetime.parse dob. So it gives me different ways of creating those constructors from different sources of information. That is an overloaded constructor, and that's how constructors are built. The constructor is called whenever we're creating a new instance of the data object. So in this case here, I have an array named occupant with an index of RM. It's going to be our room number. And we're going to create in that array a new patient object, and we're going to pass it the room number as an integer. This XYZ element 1 is the first name coming from my data source. XYZ element 2 is the last name, and DT is the date time object. That's going to create a new instance in our array, and then we're using that array to populate the list box in our interface. So here's one where I'm setting a room to be empty, and so we're going to use the current room. We've discharged this patient, so the current room is the index of my array, and I'm going to change its contents to a new patient with the current room as the room number, null strings for first and last name, and then I'm going to take today as a date time object and convert it to a short date string. That's going to be a string value. And when I'm creating this new patient, it's going to call that overloaded constructor because our fourth parameter here is a string. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the C# Xamarin Programming Cohort playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos that I create, you can click my picture up in the top right and subscribe to the channel.